Blood smells like copper and old rain. Most people don't know that. Cassidy does. She's lying in 3 inches of freezing mud, crosshairs leveled at a guard smoking a stale cigarette. 32 men are in the camp below. By dawn, 32 men will be dead. No one will hear a thing. Mud squelched inside her left boot. Cassidy had stopped feeling her toes 3 hours ago. Cold was a quiet, insidious thing. It didn't stab. It just slowly erased parts of your body from your mind. She shifted her weight, a microscopic movement against the slick bark of a rotting hemlock. Water dripped from the brim of her boonie hat, a steady, maddening metronome. Plink, plink, plink. Down in the valley, a generator coughed, choked, and settled into a low, throbbing hum. The compound was a brutalist scar of concrete and rusted, corrugated iron against the dark tree line. Faint yellow light spilled from a cracked window, illuminating a patch of bruised earth. She tasted salt and stale coffee on her lips. Her jaw ached from clenching. It wasn't the heroic, steely resolve they sell in the recruitment posters. It was just anxiety, cold and hollow, sitting right behind her ribs, making her want to throw up. Cassidy pressed her cheek against the freezing composite stock of her rifle. The scope's reticle glowed a faint, ghostly green. Rainwater pooled in the crook of her neck, sliding down her spine like an ice cube. She shivered, a sharp, ugly spasm that she hated herself for. If she jerked like that on the trigger, a round would go wild. A wild round meant noise. Noise meant she wouldn't walk out of these woods. Target 1, guard tower, north corner. He was young, pacing, slapping his arms against his sides to stay warm. Cassidy felt a fleeting, irritating spike of pity. He was miserable, just like her, but he was also holding a beaten-up AK-47, guarding a syndicate that trafficked human beings like livestock. The pity vanished, replaced by a dull, mechanical necessity. She waited for the wind. The pines above her groaned. Wait. The generator revved as a heavy door opened below. Now. Exhale. Squeeze. The rifle pushed back against her shoulder. A muffled, hollow thwump swallowed instantly by the roaring wind and the generator's mechanical cough. Through the glass, the guard folded. He didn't fly backward. Movies always got that wrong. People just dropped, like a sack of wet cement. He slumped over the sandbags, his rifle clattering softly against the wood, a sound that didn't travel past the tower. Cassidy blinked, forcing the after-image from her retina. 1 down, 31 to go. Her throat felt tight. She reached for the hydration tube at her shoulder, taking a tiny sip. The water was lukewarm and tasted of plastic. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her stomach from turning. The first one was always a shock to the system, no matter how many times she'd done it. The transition from observer to executioner was never smooth. It felt like stepping off a curb you didn't know was there. She adjusted her bipod. The mud was giving way slightly. She grabbed a handful of dead pine needles, stuffing them under the right leg of the bipod to stabilize it. Her fingers were stiff, clumsy. She scraped her knuckle against a rock, tearing the skin. Blood welled up, dark and thick. She sucked on the cut, tasting the iron, then wiped it on her trousers. No time to care. Target 2. A guy stepping out to take a leak near the motor pool. The crosshairs settled on his chest. He was looking up at the sky, cursing the rain. Cassidy tracked his movement. He zipped up, turned, thwump. He crumpled into the mud next to the massive tire of a transport truck. The shadows swallowed him whole. Target 3 and 4, 2 men by the fire barrel near the main entrance. This was tricky. They were close together. Taking one might alert the other. Cassidy watched them for 10 minutes. Her knee was throbbing, an old injury flaring up in the damp cold. She pressed it harder into the dirt, trying to crush the nerve to numb the pain. The two men were sharing a cigarette, passing it back and forth. The glowing cherry illuminated their faces in brief orange flashes. She needed a distraction, or she needed to be faster than human reflex. She cycled the bolt of her rifle. The metallic snick was deafening in her own ears, but silent to the world below. One man turned away to spit. Thwump! The man holding the cigarette took the round in the neck. He collapsed, gurgling quietly. The second man spun back around, confusion registering on his face, mouth opening to shout. He didn't even know what to look for. He just saw his friend on the ground. Cassidy had already worked the bolt. The brass casing had barely hit the dirt before she fired again. Thwump! The second man dropped heavily beside the first. Silence returned, save for the rain. Cassidy lowered the rifle, resting her forehead against the wet dirt. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She took a slow, deep breath, holding it for 3 seconds, then letting it out through her nose. The air smelled of wet decay. She was doing it. The ghost was moving through the camp, leaving nothing but corpses in the mud. But the tension was a physical weight, pressing down on her spine, threatening to crush her. She lay there for a long time. Time lost its structure in the dark. She watched a beetle struggle over a wet leaf inches from her nose. It was fighting for its life, completely unaware of the apex predator lying beside it. Cassidy flicked the beetle away. She wasn't a predator. She was a tired, 32-year-old woman with a bruised shoulder and a mortgage in San Diego, currently lying in a foreign swamp. She couldn't stay here. The angle was bad for the interior of the compound. She needed to move. Slowly, agonizingly, Cassidy began to crawl backward, sliding her body through the muck. The friction of the wet fabric against the ground sounded like sandpaper. A dry branch snapped under her thigh. It sounded like a gunshot. Cassidy froze, every muscle in her body locked rigid. She stopped breathing. Down in the valley, the compound remained still. A dog barked in the distance. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were shaking from the massive dump of adrenaline wreaking havoc on her nervous system. She closed her eyes, mentally cursing herself. Amateur. Fatigue bred sloppiness. Sloppiness bred body bags. She forced herself to relax, unclenching her jaw, and resumed the crawl toward a rocky outcropping 50 yards to her left. The fine mist clung to her optics, forcing Cassidy to wipe the lens with a muddy, trembling thumb. She smeared it, cursed silently, and used a dry patch from inside her collar to clear the glass. Her breathing was harsh in the tight space between the granite boulders. The rock bit into her ribs, cold and unforgiving. Down below, a card game was getting heated inside the open barracks. One man stood up, throwing a handful of bills onto an overturned wooden crate. He was shouting, pointing a finger at a heavy-set man across from him. The heavy-set man just laughed, a cruel grating sound that barely cut through the hum of the generator. 5 targets, too many for rapid single shots without someone raising the alarm. She had to wait for them to separate. Patience. It was the sniper's greatest weapon and worst enemy. Cassidy hated the waiting. It gave her brain too much time to catalogue the miseries of her body. Her left foot was completely numb now. She wriggled her toes inside her wet boot, feeling nothing but a dull, phantom pressure. The cut on her knuckle throbbed, a steady pulse of heat in the freezing night. Finally, the angry man stormed out of the barracks, kicking a stray metal bucket into the dark. It clattered loudly against the side of a building. He stomped toward the perimeter fence, muttering under his breath, striking a match to light a cigarette. He was isolating himself. Perfect. Cassidy tracked him. He stopped near the tree line, his back to the camp, facing the dark woods. Facing her. She put the crosshairs right between the glowing cherry of the cigarette and the shadow of his chin. Thwump. The cigarette spiraled into the mud, a tiny comet of orange light. The man folded forward, his face burying itself in the wet earth. 5. Inside the barracks, the game continued. 4 left. Then, the heavy door to the main cinderblock building, the command center, banged open. 2 men walked out. One was holding a flashlight, sweeping the beam across the muddy courtyard. He was looking for something, or someone. Cassidy's stomach tightened. Had they missed the guy who went to take a leak? Had the tower guard failed to check in? The beam of the flashlight swept over the transport truck. It danced over the tires, hovered near the rear axle, and then stopped. The harsh white light illuminated the boots of the dead man near the truck. Cassidy didn't have time to calculate wind or wait for a gust. If that man shouted, the entire camp would wake up, and 30 men would start pouring fire into the tree line. She swung the heavy rifle, her shoulder screaming in protest at the sudden movement. The crosshairs snapped onto the man with the flashlight. He opened his mouth to yell. Thwump! The round caught him in the chest. He stumbled backward, the flashlight flying from his hand, spinning wildly through the air before landing in a puddle. Its beam pointed uselessly at the sky. But the second man was right there. He saw his partner fall. He didn't freeze in confusion. He instantly reached for the radio on his chest rig. Cassidy racked the bolt. Her wet hands slipped on the metal handle. Damn it! She fumbled, slamming her palm violently against the bolt to force it up and back. The spent brass casing ejected, hitting her in the cheek with a sharp sting. She slammed the bolt forward, chambering a new round, scraping her knuckles against the mount. The man had the radio in his hand. He was pressing the transmit button. She didn't aim for center mass. It would take a fraction of a second too long for his body to shut down. She aimed for the center of his hand, holding the radio. Thwump! The heavy round shattered the plastic device and tore through the man's hand, burying itself deep in his stomach. He fell silently, dropping to his knees, clutching his ruined hand against his gut, his face contorted in a silent scream. He tipped over sideways into the mud, writhing in mute agony. Cassidy exhaled a long, shuddering breath. Her lungs felt scorched. She pressed her forehead against the back of her hand, the cold metal of the rifle barrel brushing against her temple. She was hyperventilating. Nausea rolled over her in thick, sour waves. She dry-heaved quietly into the dirt, her stomach cramping violently. Get it together, Cass, she told herself. You're not done. She forced herself to look through the scope again. The flashlight in the puddle cast long, eerie shadows across the 2 bodies. Anyone looking out a window would see them. The clock was ticking now. It was no longer a stalk. It was a race against discovery. Inside the barracks, the card players were oblivious. A tinny radio was playing loud, distorted heavy metal music, masking the subtle sounds outside. Cassidy went back to work. It was mechanical now, cold, brutal, and devoid of thought. A man stepped out of the latrine. Thwump! He dropped. A mechanic rolled out from under a rusted jeep. Thwump! He stopped moving. 2 guards walked the eastern perimeter fence, heads down against the drizzle. She took the trailing guard first. The lead guard turned to ask his partner a question, only to find empty air. Before the confusion could register on his face, Cassidy fired again. They fell into the tall grass, swallowed entirely by the darkness. Her shoulder was a mass of bruised, throbbing agony. Every time she pulled the trigger, the recoil punched into the inflamed muscle, sending a jolt of pain up her neck. Her right eye ached from staring relentlessly through the optic. The world outside the small green circle of the scope ceased to exist. There was only the reticle, the target, and the math. Distance, wind, drop, squeeze, 12 down, 15 down, 20 down. The camp was becoming a graveyard, and nobody knew it. The men inside the concrete bunker were sleeping through their own funerals. The ghost was in the wires, moving through the shadows, a silent reaping in the rain. But the silence was heavy. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears, thick with the unsaid, heavy with the weight of severed lives. Cassidy felt the crushing pressure of it pressing her deeper into the mud. She wasn't a hero saving the day in a blaze of glory. She was just a mechanic, and her tools were lead and distance. She reloaded her magazine. The sharp click of the metal seating into place felt unnervingly loud. She checked her watch. 300 hours. The rain was stopping, the clouds breaking slightly, to let a sliver of moonlight paint the carnage below in pale, ghostly silver. The hardest part was yet to come. The command center. Rainwater slid down the barrel of the rifle, gathering at the muzzle brake before dripping silently onto the moss. Cassidy was entirely numb now. Her body had stopped shivering, which medical training told her was the first real warning sign of hypothermia. She ignored it. You couldn't shoot a heavy rifle accurately when your core temperature crashed, but you also couldn't pack up and walk away with targets still breathing. 14 men were left. Most of them were congregated in the main cinder-block bunker, a fortified square of grey concrete with 2 small reinforced windows. Changing positions was no longer a tactical choice. It was a desperate necessity to get an angle on the bunker's heavy steel door. Cassidy began the agonizing process of dragging herself sideways along the ridgeline. Every inch was a negotiation with her own failing muscles. Her elbows dug into the sludge, pulling her torso forward. Her gear scraped against roots, the Kevlar of her plate carrier feeling like it weighed 80 pounds. She breathed through her mouth, short, shallow gasps, terrified that the steam of her breath would billow up and catch the faint moonlight. She tasted bile at the back of her throat. A sharp, stinging cramp seized her right calf, locking the muscle into a knot so tight it felt like a knife blade twisting against the bone. She squeezed her eyes shut, biting down hard on the inside of her cheek to keep from groaning. The coppery taste of fresh blood flooded her mouth. She held her breath, waiting for the cramp to subside, her face pressed deep into the smelling salts of rotting pine needles and wet dirt. 10 minutes later, she finally slid behind the rotting stump of a fallen oak. It offered a straight line of sight to the bunker's entrance. Cassidy settled the rifle. Her shoulder joint cracked loudly as she pulled the stock tight into her pocket. Through the optic, the bunker looked like a tomb. Faint, bluish light flickered through the dirty glass of the right window. A television. Shooting through glass was a nightmare. Snipers hated it. Glass didn't just shatter, it altered the trajectory of a bullet. Even at this relatively short distance, a quarter-inch deflection meant hitting a shoulder instead of a brainstem. A wounded man would scream. A screaming man meant the end of the ghost story. She needed them to open the door. Cassidy settled her reticle on the heavy iron handle of the bunker door and waited. Time dragged, stretching into a surreal, elastic blur. She tried to do prime number calculations in her head to stay awake. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. Her right eye burned from the strain of keeping the pupil dilated in the dark. The silence of the dead camp was heavier now, almost oppressive. It felt like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what she would do next. 13, 17, 19. The heavy steel door scraped open. Yellow light violently spilled out into the mud, casting long, warped shadows across the courtyard. A man stepped into the frame. He was massive, wearing a tight, stained tank top despite the freezing temperature. He held a half-empty bottle of clear liquor in one hand, swaying slightly. He didn't look at the dark courtyard. He looked up at the sky, letting out a long, ragged belch. He was a static target, framed perfectly in the doorway. It was almost too easy. It felt like a trap. Cassidy controlled her breathing. Inhale, exhale halfway, pause. The crosshairs rested directly on the center of the man's sternum. Thwomp! The bullet struck him with the force of a sledgehammer. The bottle shattered on the concrete, liquor spraying like mist in the yellow light. The massive man didn't even stumble. He just collapsed backward into the bunker, his boots scraping against the threshold as he vanished from sight. Cassidy immediately shifted her aim slightly to the right, keeping her crosshairs locked on the open doorway. Inside, a voice yelled, a sharp, confused bark in a language she didn't care to translate. It wasn't an alarm yet. It was annoyance. Someone thought the big guy had just tripped in his drunken stupor. A second man stepped into the doorway, looking down at the floor, reaching out a hand to help his fallen comrade. Cassidy didn't hesitate. She didn't let him process the pool of dark blood expanding on the concrete. Thwomp! He pitched forward, tumbling out of the doorway and landing face first in the mud outside the bunker. Panic finally erupted. Voices screamed inside the concrete box. Someone kicked the heavy steel door shut from the inside with a resounding metal clang that echoed off the trees. They knew. Cassidy cursed under her breath, cycling the bolt rapidly. The hot brass ejected, landing on her frozen wrist. It burned, but she barely felt it. She shifted her scope to the window. The bluish light of the television vanished. Someone had killed the power inside the bunker. Smart. They were trapped inside a concrete box, but they were also shielded. She couldn't penetrate cinder block. Cassidy's earpiece crackled with static, a dull hiss of dead air. She was completely cut off from command until the extraction window. There was no air support coming, no drone to drop a hellfire. Just her, a bolt-action rifle, and a dwindling supply of match-grade ammunition. She kept her crosshairs trained on the window. They had to look out. Curiosity and fear always demanded a visual. Humans were visual predators. They couldn't stand being hunted by something they couldn't see. A shadow shifted behind the dirty glass. Just a flicker of movement. Cassidy dialed down her magnification to increase her field of view. She watched the glass. It was thick, probably double-paned. A shot would deflect down and to the left. She aimed high and right, targeting the upper corner of the shadow mass. She squeezed. Thwomp! The glass shattered, a web of white cracks spidering outward as the heavy bullet punched through. Inside, a man screamed, a high, reedy sound that cut right through Cassidy's chest. A hit, but not a kill. The math had been slightly off. Damn it, she thought, racking the bolt again, sloppy. Blind, panicked gunfire erupted from the shattered window. The deafening crack, crack, crack of an AK-47 shattered the silence of the valley. Muzzle flashes strobed brightly in the dark, illuminating the terrified face of the shooter hiding behind the concrete sill. He was firing wildly into the trees, but he was aiming 50 yards too far to her left. The loud reports of the rifle masked her next shot entirely. Cassidy aimed straight for the muzzle flash, trusting the geometry. Thwomp! The AK-47 choked and fell silent. The barrel of the weapon clattered against the window frame, slipping downward until it disappeared inside. The screaming stopped. 11 left. Chaos had finally infected the barracks. The men playing cards had heard the panicked burst of the AK-47. The heavy metal music was abruptly shut off. Cassidy shifted her rifle back towards the wooden structure. The men inside were making a fatal mistake. They thought they were under assault by a rival cartel or a platoon of soldiers. They were gearing up for a firefight, shouting orders, slamming magazines into their weapons. The wooden door of the barracks was kicked open. 3 men rushed out simultaneously, fanning out into the mud. They were sweeping their flashlights wildly, screaming at each other, their boots splashing heavily in the puddles. Cassidy tracked the man on the far right. He was sprinting toward the motor pool, seeking the cover of the heavy transport truck. Thwump! He dropped mid-stride, his face burying itself in the muck, his momentum carrying his lifeless body sliding across the wet earth. The other 2 men saw him fall. They didn't see the muzzle flash. They didn't hear the shot. The invisible reaper had just reached out and dragged their friend into the dark. Terror took hold. It was palpable, radiating up the hillside. One of the men simply snapped. He raised his rifle to his shoulder and began emptying his magazine in a full 360-degree arc, screaming at the top of his lungs. Tracers zipped through the canopy high above Cassidy, shredding pine cones and snapping branches. The noise was deafening, a localized war zone of one man's making. Cassidy watched him through the scope. The strobe of his own rifle illuminated his face. He was young, maybe 19. His eyes were wide, white, and completely devoid of rational thought. He was just a terrified kid holding a piece of stamped metal. Her finger hovered over the trigger. A sudden, heavy wave of exhaustion washed over her. She didn't want to do this anymore. The cold, the mud, the smell of copper in her mouth. It was hollowing her out. She was tired of watching men turn into meat through a glass circle. The kid's rifle clicked empty. He stood there, chest heaving, smoke curling from the barrel of his gun. He looked around, suddenly realizing the terrible silence that had returned. Thwump! Cassidy closed her eyes as the recoil pushed into her bruised shoulder. She didn't watch him fall, she just cycled the bolt. The remaining men in the camp completely lost their nerve. The discipline of the syndicate vanished, replaced by the primitive, animal urge to survive. They poured out of the barracks, out of the latrines, scrambling out of the shadows. They weren't fighting back, they were running. They ran toward the vehicles, but a man collapsed halfway there. Thwump! They ran toward the perimeter fence. Another dropped into the tall grass. Thwump! It was a turkey shoot, cold, clinical, and deeply ugly. Cassidy's movements became robotic. Target, adjust, breathe, squeeze, rack, target, adjust, breathe, squeeze, rack. The barrel of her rifle was radiating intense heat, creating a faint mirage in her optic. She was running out of ammunition. Her hands were smeared with carbon and blood from her own scraped knuckles. Down below, the courtyard was a slaughterhouse. Bodies lay strewn across the mud in unnatural, broken postures. Only one man was left. He had made it to the edge of the tree line, directly below Cassidy's position. He was scrambling up the muddy embankment on his hands and knees, sobbing audibly. He had dropped his weapon. He was just trying to claw his way into the dark woods to hide. Cassidy tracked him. The reticle rested squarely between his shoulder blades as he pulled himself up by a thick fern. He was unarmed. He was fleeing. Under different rules of engagement, he might be a prisoner. But this wasn't a military operation with tribunals and holding cells. This was a sanitization protocol. No witnesses, no survivors. The syndicate couldn't know they were being hunted by the state. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The man slipped on the wet mud, sliding backward down the embankment. He landed on his back, staring straight up at the ridgeline. Staring straight at where she was hidden, though she knew he couldn't see her. His face was streaked with dirt and tears. He put his hands up in front of his face, a pathetic, universal gesture of surrender to an enemy he couldn't even see. He begged in a hoarse, broken whisper. Cassidy's jaw clenched. The knot in her stomach twisted violently. She was a sniper, not an executioner. But out here, in the dark, the line didn't exist. She held her breath. The silence was deafening. Thwump! The man's hands fell to his sides. His head rolled to the right. Cassidy stared through the scope for a long time, watching the rain begin to fall again, washing the mud from his dead face. 32. It was done. Slowly, agonizingly, she engaged the safety on her rifle. She didn't feel relief. She didn't feel victory. She felt like a ghost fading away into the damp wood. She packed her gear with mechanical inefficiency, her frozen fingers fumbling with the buckles of her pack. She policed her brass, crawling through the muck to find the spent casings, burying them deep in her dump pouch. Leave no trace. By the time she began the grueling 10-mile hike to the extraction point, the eastern horizon was turning a bruised, greyish purple. Dawn was breaking. The camp behind her was utterly silent, save for the hum of the generator, coughing in the rain, running for dead men who would never turn it off. The ghosts don't always wear sheets. Sometimes they wear mud and carry suppressed rifles. Cassidy's story isn't about glory. It's about the silent, brutal reality of shadows doing the work no one else can. If this raw, unfiltered look into the dark side of special operations gripped you, hit that like button. Share this video with a friend who loves military grit and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below. Would you have the nerve to pull the trigger?